At the trial of November 7th, 1884, the facts of the case were found to be as follows. 4 men, Thomas Dudley, Edward Stevens, a man named Brooks, and an English cabin boy who was between 17 and 18 years of age, were all able-bodied English seamen and the crew of an English commercial yacht. On July 5th, 1884, they were cast away in a storm on the high seas, 1,600 miles from the Cape of Good Hope, that's South Africa, and were compelled to put into an open boat. So they're in the middle of nowhere. In this boat, they had no supply of water and no supply of food except 2 one-pound tins of turnips. For 3 days, they had nothing else to subsist upon. On the 4th day, they caught a small turtle, which they ate for a few days. This was the only food they had up to the 20th day. On the 12th day, the remains of the turtle were entirely consumed. For the next 8 days, they had nothing to eat. They had no fresh water except the rain that they from time to time caught in their oilskin capes. The boat was drifting on the ocean and was probably more than 1,000 miles away from land. On the 18th day, when they had been 7 days without food and 5 without water, Dudley and Stevens spoke to Brooks about what should be done if no help came, and suggested that someone should be sacrificed to save the rest. Brooks dissented, and the cabin boy, to whom they were understood to refer, was not consulted. On the 24th of July, Dudley proposed to Stevens and Brooks that lots should be cast to determine who should be put to death to save the rest. Brooks refused to consent, and the question was not put to the boy. So there was no drawing of lots. Dudley and Stevens on that day spoke of their having families and suggested it would be better to kill the boy that their lives should be saved. Dudley proposed that if there was no vessel in sight by the next morning, the boy should be killed. The next day, the 25th of July, no vessel appeared. Dudley told Brooks that he had better go and have a nap, and he then made signs to Stevens and Brooks that the boy should be killed. Stevens agreed to the act, but Brooks dissented from it. The cabin boy was then lying at the bottom of the boat, quite helpless and extremely weakened by starvation and by having drunk seawater. He was unable to make any resistance and did not offer any assent to his being killed. Dudley offered a prayer asking forgiveness for them all if they should be tempted to commit a rash act. He asked that their souls might be saved. Then Dudley, with the assent of Stevens, went to the boy and, telling him that his time had come, put a knife to his throat and killed him. The 3 men then fed upon the body and blood of the boy for 4 days. On the 4th day after the act had been committed, their boat was picked up by a passing vessel, and the men were rescued, still alive, but in the lowest state of prostration. They were carried to the port of Falmouth and committed for trial at Exeter. If the men had not fed upon the body of the boy, they would probably not have survived to be picked up and rescued, but would within the 4 days have died of starvation. The boy, being in a much weaker condition, was likely to have died before them. At the time of the act in question, there was no sail in sight, nor any reasonable prospect of relief. Okay, so there you have it. This is a very famous case, the Dudley-Stevens case, and I'm highlighting it here because it brings out some very important philosophical issues. And I want us to imagine that we are jurors, and I want us to decide, first of all, whether we will convict these guys of murder or acquit them of murder. Okay? Acquit or convict. I want to first of all hear from someone who would convict. Who would convict of murder in this case? Cameron. Why so?
I would say convict because they did consciously choose to end the boy's life.
Okay.
Before it had naturally ended.
Is premeditated killing of an innocent. Okay. Good. That's a strong case. Others? Does anybody else agree? Does anyone else want to convict for murder?
Yeah, agreed.
Agree? Okay. Prosper, you too? Okay. All right. Who would acquit? Would anybody acquit? Because they ate him?
Like if they would just thrown him overboard, it would have been like a dire circumstance.
Is it like eating him? Doesn't that mitigate it a little bit because it's less wasteful? That's a joke. Okay, that's totally a joke. Okay. All right. Okay. Would anybody go for something in the middle where it's like conviction on a lesser charge but not murder because these guys are in such terrible circumstances? I mean, they haven't. Something like that, okay.
And then they could also say that they put him out of his misery. Like it was like a merciful.
There's a mercy killing.
Mercy to kill him.
Oh, really? Well, but he wasn't consulted. I'm not sure if he wanted
Yeah,
that.
that's the problem. That he didn't say.
The problem was that he couldn't do anything about it because he was already waiting like a week.
Right.
No food or anything like that.
Right. Okay. All right. Fascinating. Fascinating. Okay. My strong intuition when I face a case like this is that something bad happened. So some wrong was committed. The question is, how wrong was the wrong, I guess. Now, we are standing here in this climate-controlled environment. It's a little warm in here, actually. We've had lunch. We feel well-fed, well-rested. Maybe not well-rested. But anyway, we feel well-fed. And it's easy for us to make decisions like that when we are in conditions like this. These guys have been without food for who knows how many days. 7 days without food and 5 without water. They're probably in an incredible state of distress. Desperate, in fact. And yet, my strong intuition is that they did something wrong, even badly wrong. Maybe they should have waited for somebody to die first and then eat him. Okay, but then you can't guarantee that it'll be the boy. It could have been one of them. So maybe that's what they were thinking. They thought that because they had families, their lives should be saved and the boy should be killed. At least that was the reasoning they used with each other. And for these kinds of reasons, for the selfishness and the fact that they killed an innocent, I think I would convict. I would convict of murder, but I'm not sure whether my sentence would be very strong. In fact, let's talk about that for just a minute, okay? I think most of us would convict of something. So let's talk about the sentencing phase. Let me give you guys some options. 6 months, 2 years, 15 years, life imprisonment, life, or death. Let's make it a line of options like this. Would anyone give them 6 months? This is something much more serious than that. Okay. Do I have any takers for 2 years? 15 years. 15 years is too much. Okay. 2 years, somewhere in between, 5 years?
In between, yeah.
Okay, in between. Thank you. Okay, so I have one taker for something like this. I'll just put you right there, man. Yes and yes?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, do I have any takers for 15 years? 1, 2. Do I have any takers for life? Do I have any takers for death? 1, 2 takers for death. This is Texas after all. Yeah, hang them high. Okay, okay. So, I think I would probably, I would convict of murder, and I would probably give him 15 years. I think I would vote with the kind of the majority in here. Actually, I want to hear from the people who advocated the death penalty, if you don't mind. So Tiffany also, yeah. Why the death penalty for this? But it like improved their well-being.
For 4 days, they could have held it for 4 days.
They didn't know that.
Still.
So
Or they could have waited for him to die. Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
honestly, I don't see what eating him has to do with it, really. Okay, like once he's dead, you can eat him. That's my view.
So like desecrating a body in that sort of sense.
It's cool to eat him raw. Who cares?
They slit his throat. Like, they killed him.
Wait.
Yeah, well, the murder's wrong. So like, the killing it, like if I would convict, I would convict for the murder. But like once he's dead, just eat him. That's my view, at least.
For survival.
I'm still conflicted because like the thing is, I chose the death penalty.
Mm-hmm.
Something like this is really difficult to decide, but I feel like thinking was it like mentioned that the boy had like family?
He did not have family, apparently. Yeah. So they used this as a reason amongst each other for killing the boy.
Now the fact that putting them to death would maybe, in a sense, be a waste of the boy's death because they used him to live, but still that wasn't for his will.
For sure. Yeah. He was not consulted in any of this.
I would have chosen life, but that's a waste of taxpayers' money. So
These guys don't deserve to use up, soak up taxpayers' money.
yeah, they definitely were in like a dire like situation, and under the influence of that situation, they're not acting, as a reasonable person should.
Okay.
But like if this were to go to like an actual like modern court case, I don't know how this would like play out. I don't think it would stop at just a trial. It would probably go up to an appellate case, or I don't know. It's difficult, but I'd say kill him.
You'd say kill him.
Yeah.
Just kill him. Okay. Thank you for your honesty. Notice that our opinions on this topic differ in part on the basis of our views on where moral principles come from. So Aquinas would say that they are built into the order of nature. And these guys pretty clearly, they are in a state of nature. If ever there was a state of nature, they are outside of civilization in some sort of state of nature at this point. There is nothing within 1,000 miles of them to their knowledge. And Aquinas would say, and I think many of us in this room would say, that moral principles actually are present in the world that we inhabit. And to kill an innocent, like killing the cabin boy, is to violate the moral principles that are present in nature. So the moral principles do not get suspended by virtue of them being in a state of nature. Okay, other people would argue that moral principles come from civilization. In other words, for these people, human beings acting together in civilization make up moral principles for themselves. Moral principles are a construct that we have originated for ourselves, maybe so that we can ourselves flourish more. Why do I not want you to steal my things? Why do I prohibit myself from stealing your things? Well, if you were to steal my things, I would flourish less, so let's just make a general rule against all stealing so that I can flourish more. Okay, and on this view of things, moral principles are, again, a fictional construct which are made up in civilization so that we human beings can live together more successfully. These are two very, very different views about where moral principles come from. One says we discover them in the natural surroundings. The other says we make them up for ourselves in civilization. Okay, also another fault line on which we probably differ, and I think it shaped our thoughts here, is the fault line of principles. Actually, let me make it principles versus consequences. Okay, I didn't have any out-and-out consequentialists in the discussion just now. But there are some out there. Some people would say principles matter most when it comes to moral decision making. And if principles like preserve and protect innocence get violated, then that should be punished. End of story, regardless of the consequences. Others would say, well, if the consequences of the action are good for the collective or for the majority or something, then the action can be justified. And for these people, what makes the action justifiable is the fact that it brought about good consequences. In other words, what lends the action its moral valence is the consequences that stem from the action. Now, most of us in this room just now in our discussion said we agreed that something wrong had happened. And it's something that we would probably all also agree is stemming from a violation of principle. But there are some people who would say that these dudes in a boat, they constitute a community among themselves, and the community actually is benefited by the action. So the community can profit from it, so it is a justifiable action. Okay, now, consequentialism taken to an extreme is, I think it's a horrendous worldview, to be honest. But moderate consequentialism often is justifiable. What would be consequentialism taken to an extreme? Well, what if we could make 98% of the population deliriously happy by making 2% of the population our slaves, and compelling 2% of the population to do all of those tasks that none of the rest of us wants to do? You know, clean the latrines, like every task you ever wanted to not have to do, you can make the slave do it. Okay, pretty clearly that would be a horrific thing, a horrific social setup. And yet on pure consequentialism, consequentialism taken to an extreme, it might be the most justifiable outcome because it's the one that would make the majority happiest, arguably. Okay, so pure consequentialism is dangerous. At any rate, though, some would argue on this particular case that these guys did something that was justifiable. They would acquit and say these guys did something that was justifiable because these guys did something that had good consequences for the community. Okay, it's not my view, but it is a view. Yes?
I feel like jurisdiction really matters here, because like you were saying, they made that decision while they were out, on the boat.
Mm-hmm.
Probably applied to the laws of nature.
Mm-hmm.
Once they've come back to civilization, they have to be charged for the crimes that they made while in a different
Yep,
place.
definitely.
I think what jurisdiction matters.
Yeah, so the question here at stake in this issue is very much a question that arises when we're studying Aquinas, right? It's a question of when these guys were out there on the open ocean in the boats, were the laws of morality as they normally exist in civilization suspended? And if they were suspended, then these guys deserve, clemency, even acquittal. If they were not suspended, then it presumably is incumbent upon the court of law, once they return to civilization, to impose rules upon them where there was previously no enforcement of the rules that they violated when they were on the boat in the open ocean. Okay, just for what it's worth, guys, these guys were convicted. This is a very famous case. They were convicted of murder. And this was the 19th century. They were sentenced to be hung. There was a widespread public outcry following that sentencing. And the Queen of England, Queen Victoria, commuted their sentence to 10 months in prison. So they walked after 10 months. That was the historical case. They walked after 10 months. Now, it wouldn't have been my decision, but it was what they decided eventually after the public outcry. I share this case with us today because this case is crucial to understanding some central things in Aquinas. Now, if you would open up Blackboard, I've decided not to post on Blackboard the primary text, but I did post some days ago a secondary text describing Aquinas's views about the origins and source of morality. Okay, and I want to read from that a little bit so that we understand Aquinas's ideas here. Augustine may have been the first articulator of the natural law idea following the ancients, but Aquinas brought it to a much more sophisticated development. Okay, let me just begin reading here in the document for us. I'm reading here on page 3. Actually, page 2. God, the ultimate cause of all being, activity, and development, and everything that is nothing if not caring for the community of creation, and as universal creator, he has the authority to the highest degree with respect to his intelligent creatures. Okay, is he not the lawmaker, lawgiver par excellence? Okay, for Aquinas, God is the ultimate lawgiver in the universe. God lays down all laws in the universe. Okay, Thomas maintains that we have a law of God's making that is co-eternal with his own nature. This is the eternal law through which the divine intellect creatively designs and directs all creatures to a common end. All right, so the first idea in Aquinas' view on law is that there is an eternal law. It's like the overall umbrella term here, the eternal law. The eternal law is just, when you see eternal law in Aquinas, think here laws of nature. Okay, these are just overarching rules, always and everywhere the case, and they apply to all creatures in the universe. Okay, God is the lawgiver, and God has set up the universe in accordance with eternal law in order to direct the affairs of the created beings within it. Okay, let me scroll down a little bit. Within the eternal law, there is natural law, there's also divine law. Let's focus on natural law first. Okay, the natural law I'm reading here, according to Aquinas, has certain basic and self-evident precepts or dictates knowable to any human with a properly functioning intellect and a modicum of experience of the world. Okay, so just to paraphrase that, for Aquinas, natural law is the eternal law as it pertains to humans. And it is the body of principles that God has set up for us for our flourishing. This is crucial to understanding this view of morality and where it comes from. For Aquinas, rules are good for us. It's actually, we flourish more when we have rules, okay, on his view of things. Think of it as the, think of it with an illustration here, right? Okay, so I have rules in my house. I've got a 5-year-old, a 3-year-old, and a 1-year-old. And they are not allowed to play between the sidewalk and the street. It is too close to the street because they're kind of, uncoordinated and they can fall in the street, right? So they have to play on my side, the yard side of the sidewalk. Not allowed to go near the street. These rules are for their flourishing. They think actually that they could flourish more if they were able to play near the street, but they're wrong. They won't flourish more. They'll flourish less if they play near the street. Okay, actually there's something, you can see it early on in human psychology, even in a 3-year-old. There's something about the fact of the rule that makes us want to violate it. Like, previously you didn't want to trespass, but you see this no trespassing sign, and now you suddenly have this burning desire to trespass, where you previously had no awareness that you even wanted to do this sort of thing. But anyway, these rules are for my children's good, and for Aquinas, that's the essence of the natural law, is that there are certain rules that God has set up for our good so that we will flourish more by living in accordance with them. It's like boundaries. These boundaries are good for us, according to him. Okay, now reading on a little bit. Paraphrasing Thomas, first and fundamental is the precept that anything good is to be pursued, and the opposite of this good, evil, is to be avoided in all human acts. In other words, the core principle of the natural law is good is to be done and evil is to be avoided. Other basic precepts, but with specific content, would include those such as bodily health is a good to be pursued and bodily harm avoided, or knowledge is a good to be pursued and ignorance and falsehood avoided, or friendship is a good to be pursued and those things opposed to it avoided. Okay, so God has just set up human beings on this view of things with certain kinds of capacities and certain kinds of rules in order to show us how to use our capacities successfully. And these rules are things that help shape our bodily health, help shape our knowledge, awareness of the world around us, help shape our friendships, our relationships, etc. Okay, and it is by the use of our reason that we ascertain what these rules are on this view of things. In each case, human reason grasps that some object is perfective of human nature and so directs that nature toward it by an at least tacit precept or action guide while directing it away from that good's contrary. Okay, now Aquinas argues that this is self-evident for people who have capacities of reason. I put it up here a minute ago, but he falls down on the side of nature and not civilization. He would say that these principles are self-evident to all persons who are situated as people in the world and not just all persons who are situated within a particular cultural context. So it's available to all. Okay, the natural law usually leads to the positive law, as I mentioned when I talked about Augustine. And most positive laws are derived from the natural law. I've already talked about that in class, so I'm not going to talk about it now. Divine law is natural law. Back up. Natural law is that body of law that directs us toward our earthly ends. And we can succeed as human beings when we act in accordance with natural law principles. Okay, so Aquinas thinks that you can be a perfectly good person if you act in accordance with the principles of the natural law. Even if you're not a Christian, you can be perfectly good. Okay? But he also thinks that there is another body of law that God has provided us with, the divine law, which directs us toward our supernatural ends. So natural law directs us toward our earthly ends, natural ends. Divine law directs us toward our supernatural ends. You can be a good person morally. You can live a good human life and be a successful, flourishing human being by acting in accordance with the natural law. But you need the divine law, and you need to act in accordance with the divine law in order to succeed vis-a-vis your supernatural ends. Okay, in the divine law, he divides into old and new. And not to wade too far into the weeds here, but basically, when you see divine law in Aquinas, think of Aquinas' account of human salvation and of supernatural flourishing. So the Hebrews in the Old Testament believed that they would be saved through the animal sacrifice system. Turns out in the New Testament, that's the old divine law. Here's the new divine law. Turns out in the New Testament, we find out that the animal sacrifice system was just a foreshadowing of the ultimate sacrifice of Jesus of Nazareth. So it wasn't actually what was saving the Hebrews. It was simply a representation of what actually saves humans. Okay, and so for Aquinas, you can only achieve your supernatural end by believing in the salvific mission of Jesus of Nazareth and accepting the new divine law. Okay, well, a couple other comments in general on this topic. For Aquinas, God is the lawgiver. There are lots of people following Aquinas. This is a real influential articulation of this view. There are lots of people following Aquinas who would say morals are built into the natural order, but that's just the end of the story. It's not that God is the author of this. It's just that the natural order comes to us with morals, period. Okay? That's not Aquinas' view. Aquinas' view is that God is the author of these things, and it is God who is the source and has built into the natural world around us these principles. Okay, Yeah, and like I mentioned, it is through the use of our reason that we discern what these principles are. Okay, let me pause for questions or comments on these things. Reflections, questions, or comments?
So would divine law is more of, I guess, like supernatural or like afterlife sort of law?
Yes.
Okay.
So he conceives of human behavior and human flourishing and human relationships all in terms of this legal framework. This is a very influential view. And so he conceives of salvation, human salvation, in terms of a legal framework too. And so he says, we need to act in accordance with rules in order to achieve personal flourishing. And in an earthly context, that means natural law. But in order to achieve personal flourishing in a supernatural, eternal context, that means acting in accordance with the divine law, the dictates of the divine law, the rules of the divine law. Yeah. So his view is that it takes like an extra step. You got to do something more than just be a good person in order to flourish qua supernatural being. For Aquinas, it's important to remember that he's a dualist, so he thinks that we are two things. Humans are bodies and souls. And as embodied creatures, our bodies can be oriented towards their natural ends by virtue of acting in accordance with the natural law. But we are also souls, so he thinks that in order to orient our souls toward their supernatural ends, we need to act in accordance with the divine law. So that would be his explanation there. So we're like two things simultaneously. Mm-hmm. Good. Other questions or comments?
When you say positive law, that's different from like legal positivism.
Oh, yes. If you're in Dr. Tyler's class and learning about legal positivism, that is a different term than legal positivism. In fact, it's like legal positivism is completely the opposite of Aquinas' view, actually. Yeah. Which class are you thinking of? Great Trials. Okay. Yeah, no, legal positivism is a 19th and 20th century innovation that asserts that there is no morality outside of the law. So it's just what the law says that has moral valence and force. And basically, that's like contrary to everything Aquinas is saying. Aquinas is saying that there is, like, the source of morality is actually nature. It's not human constructions like the law. And so legal positivism arises in precise opposition to Blackstone and Aquinas and that tradition. It's like they're like mortal enemies of each other, basically. Mm-hmm. Sure. Any other questions? Okay, I do want to give you guys, I did want to share a little bit more about Aquinas, but I'd also like to give you guys a bit of a heads up about Descartes. So I'm going to split the difference and talk a little bit about Descartes right now, just so that you guys can get a head start on the reading over break. Let me give you guys a little bit of background material, and then I might return to some Aquinas materials, because we're not fully caught up yet when we come back from break. But this is just so you guys can get a head start on your reading. Rene Descartes, the first philosopher of modernity. Okay, was a Frenchman. He lived at a time of incredible heady scientific developments. Okay, he himself contributed massively to these developments, and he was deeply impressed by them. He represents the first philosopher of modernity because of his method. What we're going to be encountering in the meditations is a program of systematic doubt. Instead of believing that the world is the way it appears to him, in other words, believing his senses, believing that the world is what it appears to be, Descartes says, he starts with the assumption that the world is actually not what it appears to be. And he starts with this kind of skeptical, doubting frame of mind. This makes him the first modern. Okay, whereas Aquinas, Augustine, the medievals, or Aristotle and Plato, the ancients, would have been credulous and would have just assumed that they could trust their senses and believe the world to be what it appears to be. The modern frame of mind that that Descartes represents, the turn, as it were, from credulity to incredulity. The modern frame of mind is this skeptical, questioning stance, this doubting stance that is central to the Meditations. Okay, a little bit about Descartes' background, just as a way of understanding what you're going to be encountering over break as you read the Meditations. Descartes is a good student. He grows up in actually a Thomistic school of thought, so he's schooled in Aquinas, knows his Aquinas really well, but he is famous in the tradition precisely because of his rebellion against Aquinas. Okay, so he basically spends his life philosophically rejecting Aquinas' ideas. What all did Descartes do in life? Well, after he finished his university studies, he actually lived his 20s as a mercenary soldier, which is a category we don't really have anymore. But he hired himself out to the highest bidder and lived kind of the life of a rake. Fathered a bunch of children, ran around Europe sleeping with anything he could find. Eventually, he decided to sober up and decided to make something of his life. And so in his early 30s, after about 10 or 12 years of running around, he dedicated himself to the scientific revolution. Now, the guys who were living at this time did not know yet that it was the scientific revolution. We only know that in retrospect. But they began to investigate the natural world and to call into question assumptions about the natural world that had reigned since the time of Aristotle. Okay, and it is by rejection and rebellion against the thought of Aristotle and Aquinas that the scientific revolution takes place and that Descartes' method of systematic doubt takes root. Okay, Descartes lived the life of a scholar for the second half of his life. After he sobered up, stopped drinking, lived the life of a scholar, became very famous. His books were read far and wide. He not only was a philosopher, but he was a mathematician. You've actually probably been tormented by Descartes for years in high school algebra classes. Everyone remembers this old bad boy? This is the Cartesian coordinate system, devised by Descartes as a way of visually representing equations and enabling us to conceive of equations from a different perspective. Okay, he also was a biologist. He practiced, you guys will, well, you might be horrified. Practiced vivisection. What's that? Does anybody know what vivisection is? Dissecting live animals. So he wanted to see like what the dog would do as he like dismembered the dog and the cat, etc. And so he'd like remove the spleen and see if the dog could function and like what the dog thought of that and all that. Okay. Not the sort of thing that people would do these days, since our view of animals has become very different than the view of animals that people had back then. I think people now kind of conceive of animals as their children. So like, you know, the dog, the cat, right, is the kid that you didn't have. And like you see, if you go to the grocery store these days, you'll see like an entire aisle or even two. If it's like Whole Foods, it's 2 aisles because it's the uppy store, right? It's like fully devoted to pet foods. It's crazy how people conceive of their pets differently these days. My dear Chinese friend in graduate school, he came over here to the States and he said he couldn't believe how Americans conceive of their pets as children. He said, in China, we eat our dogs. And I said, yeah, that's very different, isn't it, Li Yang? Anyway, so Descartes is famous for a lot of scientific contributions. One other anecdote about him while I'm on it. So he lived to be 54 Okay, when he was middle-aged, he was very famous and was actually offered a court position in Sweden by the Queen of Sweden, Queen Christina. She wanted him to tutor her in philosophy. Okay, now Descartes had been used to the leisurely life of a late rising scholar. He would rise at about 10 or 11 a.m. Sounds nice, doesn't it? And would devote himself just to his studies for the rest of the day. But Queen Christina wanted him to tutor her in philosophy at 6 a.m. And Sweden is really far north. And so he was having to get up in the dead of winter to teach her philosophy at 6 a.m. Unfortunately, he caught pneumonia from this, lingered for a few weeks, and died. So he died getting up to study philosophy, apparently. It's kind of a sad story. Yeah, he's very famous in the canon. You can see his grave in Paris at on the left bank. I've been to the cathedral where he's buried. Very famous grave there. Let me say a couple things about the Meditations. This is a classic work, one of the most famous works. It's taught in intro classes all over the world. The Meditations is important not because of the conclusions that Descartes reaches in it, but rather because of the method that he employs. Okay, so if as you read the Meditations, you think to yourself, this guy is nuts. I agree. He is nuts. Okay, you're preaching to the choir here if that's your opinion as you read it. Okay, I totally agree he is nuts. Yes, it is crazy to question your surroundings to the extent that he does. Right? He imagines this demon is systematically deceiving him about all the things that he experiences and has ever experienced in his life. Okay, yes, that's crazy. And no, the world is not just a figment of your own imagination that you have dreamed up for yourself, like over all these years. Okay, that's my view at least. So bear with Descartes. He is famous in the canon because of the method that he employs, the systematic doubt, but not necessarily because of the conclusions that he reaches. Okay, so his conclusions are weird, and many people have found his conclusions to be incredibly bizarre, myself included. But he is famous because the method that he employed was very influential. Okay, just FYI. Any questions about Descartes before I let you go for a break and encourage you to read the Meditations over break? All right, that's it for today then.